a president of the North Carolina NAACP. He has worked very hard to fight against draconian cuts in Medicaid, unemployment, education made by that governor and that state legislature of North Carolina. Some of his greatest work has been as the pastor of the Greenleaf Christian Church. Under his leadership, they have done some amazing work to the community to improve high levels of poverty, underemployment, drug use, and gang violence. Reverend Dr. William Barber has a long list of academic and personal accolades that would take me way too long to list them all out. So instead of me standing up here and talking about him, how about we bring him up here to talk about you all. Brothers and sisters, please give a respectful, warm welcome, warm machinist welcome to a true fighter for working people, Reverend Dr. William Barber II.
Hello to the machinists, the international. I'm glad to be here. We thank God for his grace and his mercy to be here with you. I want to thank Brother Hassan Solomon for this invitation through our dear sister Robin Williams, one of the great labor union leaders in the country and in the world. I am so pleased that some years ago I had a chance to stand on the side of the machinists at the Montour facility in North Carolina and win a labor battle there. I'm glad to be here with your president, President Martinez. I understand that this is the most diverse executive council in the union world. I understand that Brother Martinez is a Mexican-American, and he and I were just saying, we are not going to participate in building walls, we're going to build bridges. I want to talk for a moment, and I speak today, yes, I'm president of NAACP and a pastor and chair of Repairers of the Breach, but I want to speak as an individual today, as a brother. And I want to talk about why we must come together and build and have a moral revolution of values to address the moral crisis that's at the heart of our democracy right now. In 1961 and then again in 1967, Dr. King said something we should all remember. He said it might just be that the only groups that can form the massive reconstruction of American society that needs to take place to lift all people would be a coalition of blacks, poor whites, progressive whites, working class folk, union brothers and sisters, recipients of welfare, and Native Americans. He said this may be the only coalition, along with Latinos, that can shift the American economic structure and make the profound changes that are necessary. The truth of the matter is, my brothers and sisters, you cannot talk about labor rights and not talk about civil rights. You can't talk about racial justice and not talk about economic injustice as well. Dr. King understood that there's an intersectionality between dealing with racism, classism, materialism, and militarism. He understood that these things had to be held together like the fingers of a hand in order for us to deal with the reality of the American situation. 1 year later, after he said those words about coming together, he got an invitation by a labor union. That's what Dr. King was the last night of his death. He was working for labor. He was working on behalf of garbage workers. And in that sermon, that rally, he said that the wide disparities in incomes that affected blacks and poor whites in the midst of so much wealth in America was just wrong. And if it continued, it would hurt America. And he said on the final night that he was with us, he said nothing would be more tragic than for us to turn back now and to give up on the fight for racial and economic justice. Humbly standing in that tradition, I want to suggest today that we have to come together once again for a moral revolution of values, because we have a moral crisis at the heart of the American body politic. And this election season is revealing it clearer than ever before in recent history. I'm deeply concerned, and I hope you are, as we are seeing some repeating of history in America. We are seeing the repeating of some things we've already been through. You know, America went through two great reconstructions. The first reconstruction took place in the shadow of slavery, amid the wreckage of the Civil War. And after slavery, African Americans joined hands with whites in the South, farmers, many of them who were poor but who had been made to fight the Confederate War while the wealthy planters' sons stayed home. They found a way to come together, and they called it fusion politics. Black and white people came together, former slaves. And in less than 4 years after the end of slavery, they had taken over all of the legislatures in the South. They had rewritten all of the state constitutions. And in those constitutions, white and black working together, they guaranteed citizenship for all people. They built the first public schools. They raised taxes, but they raised them on the wealthy in a way that they could begin to lift up those at the bottom. They made sure that all men had access to the ballot. In fact, in my state in 1868, 69, because a black man and a white man worked together, this is the preamble they wrote to the new Constitution after slavery. We hold it to be self-evident that all persons are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, the enjoyment of the fruit of their own labor, and the pursuit of happiness. Because in 1868, those white and black folk working together after slavery, they knew that labor without decent wages and without rights was nothing more than a pseudo form of slavery. That's what they knew. They launched this experiment, and then Brother Martinez, in less than 4 years, opposition came. Many of the former Confederates saw black citizenship and white people working together as inherently illegitimate. They attacked white leaders. In fact, the Klan was first formed to attack white people, not black people, who were working together with black people. They attacked African American leaders. They assailed the taxes that the wealthy had to pay. They began to rail against public schools. They began to wail against fair wages. They began to take over the courts. They went after voting rights. And they came up with this phrase. They said, "We are trying to redeem America." Now that sounds nice, it sounds religious. But if you go back and read the literature, redeeming America, or what they called then making America great again, it meant going backwards. It meant not having the diversity. It meant not working together. It meant not paying people what they deserve and funding public education and making sure that everybody could have the right to vote. And by 1896, 98, we had something called Plessy versus Ferguson, separate but equal, and the first Reconstruction was ended. But then there was a second Reconstruction. black and white, Latino, Jews, Catholics, and Christians came together. 1954, you had the Brown decision, and they said separate but equal was unconstitutional. During this movement, this fusion movement, along with labor, they together integrated public schools. We won the Civil Rights Act of 64, the Voting Rights Act of 65. Never forget that the March on Washington was not a black march. It was a march for jobs and freedom. It was the union movement. It was the union movement and the civil rights movement in fusion politics. This fusion movement, they began to fund, they pushed for the war on poverty, they funded K through 12, they began to have Pell Grants. The fusion movement, during this reconstruction, unions were strengthened. Dr. King declared that unarmed truth and unconditional love would have the last word, and we began to move a little bit closer to being a more perfect society, perfect union. But once again, some people didn't like it. They didn't like all this diversity. They didn't like all this working together. They called themselves the Dixiecrats, conservative extremists. They revolted against black leadership and white leadership and Latino leadership and union leadership and civil rights leadership working together. They saw it as a nuisance. They saw it as a problem. So they turned to terror. Martin was killed. Medgar was killed. Viola Woosa, a black union worker, was killed out of Detroit. James Reeb was killed. But then they came up with a strategy called the Southern Strategy. And the goal of that strategy was to undercut support for union rights and civil rights, to undercut support for public schools. The Southern Strategy, developed by Kevin Phillips, he told Richard Nixon, he said, I know how to win, you just have to find out who hates who and pit them against each other. And in that movement called the Southern Strategy, they vowed to take their country back. They said that's the only way we can make it great again. The Southern Strategy. They said that if we can come up with a way to control the 13 southern states and their electorate, if we can make them right-to-work states, if we can turn white and black people against each other in those 13 southern states, we can control 173 electoral votes, which means we only need 99 from the other 37 states to win the presidency. We can control 26 U.S. Senate seats, and they'll be anti-union and anti-civil rights. We can control over 30% of the Congress, and they'll be anti-union and anti-civil rights. They call themselves the Southern Strategy, led by Strom Thurmond and Jesse Helms and many others who were the adversaries of the civil rights movement and the union movement. Well, when I know this history, and when I review this history, I'm concerned that we are seeing even today the reincarnation of the deconstruction movements of the 1800s and the 1900s. In fact, just the other day I was reading an article, and it was a scholarly article, and it said this, Brother Martinez. It said, in the February 12, 1963 issue of the National Review, the magazine's publisher, William Rusher, laid out a plan for Barry Goldwater to run and to win in the 1964 by appealing to disinfected white Southerners, wresting Southern states from Democrats, and also appealing to those disenchanted whites in the North. He goes on to say, buoyed by this Goldwater nomination in 64, he said the Goldwater Southern Strategy, inspired by the National Review, set the platform for more than a century of how you would get people, particularly in the South and in some of the West Rust Belt, to vote against their own self-interest. He said Dixie would be the new heartland for the Republican Party, which would stoke white resentment over African-American advancements. In other words, turn white and black people against each other when they actually need to be allies, particularly working whites and working blacks, and poor whites and poor blacks. He said as the Democratic Party became more multiracial, winning not just black voters, but also Latinos and most non-white immigrants, the Republicans remained an overwhelmingly white party. Listen to this. He says in this article, it's much longer, the Southern strategy was the original sin that made Donald Trump possible. If Republican voters were anywhere near as diverse as the Democrats, a candidate like Trump would have been marginalized quickly. Conservative elites can denounce Trump all they want as a cancer or an imposter. In truth, he's the heir of the Southern strategy. He's the beneficiary of those who have tried to divide this country over and over and over again. And along with the Southern strategy, there is a thesaurus. You talk race, but you don't sound racist. You talk classism, but you don't sound like a classist. The thesaurus says you talk about law and order. You talk about states' rights. Remember, it's states that block labor rights. You talk about and living wages. You talk about things like tax cuts. But all of that's coded language. And you make certain people, Latinos, black people, as not people with problems, but problem people. And what do you do with problem people? You build walls. You keep them out. Because you cannot afford to allow a diverse electorate to come together, because if it does, it will continue to push America forward. Now, the problem with Mr. Trump is not his tone, or, and I say it's really his policies. The reason they're upset with his tone is because he says in public what you're only supposed to say behind the wall. The design of the Southern strategy is to hide bigotry, is to hide xenophobia, is to not be so open about it. And yet we have Trump now, who is the heir of the Southern strategy. Why would I bring that up here today? Why would I bring that up? Because you need to understand that history, to understand why there are forces that would not want to see you and me working together, that would not want to see a diverse union room like this working together. But not only should this modern day incarnation of the Southern strategy call us together, the way in which Trump is trying to fool African Americans and deal with the race issue should be troubling to all people, black and white. Because racial injustice and class injustice are too serious to be played with. It's too serious. You think about it. Donald Trump has been telling African Americans he wants our votes, but he wasn't telling us. Think about where he started saying that. Mississippi, in front of most of their all-white audiences, saying that all their schools are bad, all of them are in poverty. That's code language. They are the problem. The goal of that is to turn particularly many Southern working class poor whites against the very allies that they need. And so then he flew to Detroit for a photo op. And he thinks that a photo op will substitute for his extreme policies. Trump said that this past weekend he went to the religious services in Detroit to listen to our message. He didn't listen. He went there. He said he was going to deal with the issue of race. But rather than address race, he tried to sell revisionist history. First thing he did was claim to be the party of Lincoln. The current day manifestation of the Republican Party under Trump is not the party of Lincoln. My granddaddy was a Republican. He was a Lincoln Republican and a Teddy Roosevelt Republican. Trump, you are no Lincoln Republican. In fact of the matter is Lincoln's Republican Party and its opposition radical Democratic Party are polar opposites of the way the parties operate today. If Trump really wanted to embrace the party of Lincoln, he would have to support voting rights. He would have to support fully public education, and he would have to support fully living wages and workers' rights and unions. He would have to do that. Now, I'm a preacher. And as I watched intensely, because everybody's welcome in the house of God, so I thought he was surely going to go in the house of God and act as the way you're supposed to act in the house of God. And the first thing you do in the house of God is repent. I thought that's what he was going to do. I thought he was going to really repent. But instead, his performance in church reminds me of the words of Jesus that says, not everyone who says, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only those who do the will of my Father. I'm not interested when somebody says, what's in his heart, or what's in somebody's heart. That's not how you figure out racism and classism. It's not what's in your heart, it's what's at the heart of your policies. That's how you determine racism. That's how you determine classism. And then if you look at what he didn't say at the church, it exposes where he's really. He didn't say that he supports the attacks on voting rights. That he came to North Carolina where we had the worst attack on voting rights. The court says this surgical racial discrimination, and he actually supported that rather than stand against it. He didn't say in that black church that he believes in taking money from public schools and giving your tax dollars to private schools that many of your children will not even be able to attend. He did not say at that meeting that he actually believes the minimum wage is too high, as he said earlier, and he does not fully support a living wage. He did not at that church meeting talk about building a wall. He did not talk about how people were coming from a particular country and how they were criminals. He didn't say that in the church. He wouldn't say that in front of that audience because it did not fit. He did not say how he would go back to trickle-down economics, the same economics that led us into a recession under George Bush, the greatest recession since the Great Depression. What else did he not say? He did not say that when he promises cities that he's going to build infrastructure to rebuild the city, you can't build infrastructure without money, and you're not going to have the money if you give all the tax cuts to the wealthy. You will not have the money to rebuild the cities. He didn't say that. He was in church, but he wasn't being real. Because he said that everywhere. He said some of these things, he said everywhere. He did not say in that church that if you elect me, I'm going to roll back the affordable health care and take 20 million Americans off health care, 3 million African Americans, and thousands of others who would have health care if Southern governors were not blocking Medicaid expansion simply because they don't like a black man in a White House. He did not say that. Economists are now saying all over the place that his economic plan would take us back into recession, would lower wages, would cut jobs, and would take us to the dangerous place of isolationism, a place in which you cannot function. In addition to that, he said, what in the hell do you have to lose? A lot. But that question shouldn't just concern black people. That question should be offensive to white people, because according to the University of Michigan National Poverty Center, there are still more poor whites than there are poor blacks in raw numbers, not in percentage, but in raw numbers. There are 8 million more poor working white people than there are black people. There are more white people that use social safety nets to get up than black people in real numbers. So the fact of the matter is, the policies that he's promoting, while he's suggesting he's dealing with these problem people, black and Latino people, the reality is it will hurt all people. And the fact of the matter is, Jesus one time used a word called hypocrite. He says that's someone who puts on a mask to cover their true faith. And he put on a mask. He did not say in that church how he was sued twice by the Department of Justice for housing discrimination against African Americans. He did not call the president in that setting ignorant, stupid, the founder of ISIS. I wonder why. Why didn't he use that language in that audience? Why does he only use that kind of language? He didn't talk about his connections to all right and some of the most extreme supremacists in this country. He didn't say anything about that. Why? Because the goal was to put on a face and to fool somebody. My friends, as I close, these are serious times. We need to understand history and how in some ways there are some who want history to repeat itself. And there is an extremist agenda that's trying to get its foothold deep into the American psyche. And that agenda is saying if you want this country to be great, if you want this country to be exceptional, here's the answer. Listen at what they're saying. You want this country to be great, attack public education and teachers. That'll make you great. If you want this country to be great, deny people a living wage and do everything you can to undermine the power of unions. If you want this country to be great, they say, suppress the right to vote, especially at the time now when blacks and whites and Latinos can join together and change the electorates all over this country. If you want this country to be great, blame all the poverty on President Obama and Sister Hillary Clinton, and don't say that 97% of the poorest counties in this country are run in so-called red states where the politicians vote against the very program that would help lift up the working poor. You want to be great? Deny people health care. Get elected. Get free health care because you get elected, but then deny the very people that elected you access to health care. If you want to be great, this is what they're saying. This is the remedy, not just Trump. This is the remedy, because there are some that don't talk like him. They're very calm, cool, and collected like Ryan, but they believe the same things for the most part. They're saying if this country is to be great, turn immigrants away, even though we sing, God bless America, shine his grace on. Don't have grace on immigrants. Don't have grace on the LGBT community. You want to be great? Ignore the corporations and the way they poison our environment. You want to be great, they're saying, dismiss legitimate discontent with the way in which the criminal justice system negatively impacts black, brown, and poor white people. And then if you really, really want to be a great country, this is how we're going to be great. Focus more on the Second Amendment than you do the First Amendment, and the 13th Amendment, and the 14th Amendment, equal protection under law, and the 15th Amendment, the right to vote. And if you really, really want to be great after you've made everybody mad against Muslims, mad against immigrants, mad against everybody, then make sure it is easier to get a gun than it is to get a voter card. And my friends, I came by here, Brother Martinez, somber, but also sober and also hopeful, recognizing that if that's what they're selling, then if they are cynical enough to be together, then we must be smart enough to come together. It is a necessity for the destiny of our democracy that we come together and fight for the furtherance of this experience. We must come together. We should embrace, I say this personally, Hillary Clinton, because she's trying, but we must also recognize no one politician can do it alone. We need a movement for what is right in this country. Civil rights and labor rights working together. Working together. We must. We must come together. We must come together in this election and beyond. And we must fight to secure pro-labor anti-poverty policies that ensure economic sustainability by fighting for full employment, labor rights, living wages, the alleviation of disparate unemployment, a green economy, affordable housing, targeted empowerment zones, strong safety nets for the poor, fair policies for immigrants, and we must critique war policies that disable our ability to have a real war on poverty right here in America. We must fight for infrastructure development, and we must fight for fair tax reform that helps those that are working and at the bottom, not those that are greedy and at the top. We must come together. We must come together. We must come together and fight for educational equality by ensuring that every child receives a high-quality, well-funded, constitutional, diverse public education and access to community college and universities, and if they want to trade, the trade school as well. We must come together. We must come together, and we must hold on to the Affordable Care Act, but then we must come into the 21st century and ensure that every American has access to universal health care, and that we protect Social Security and Medicare and our environment, and we protect women's health and the right of women to make their own choices. We must come together. We must come together. We must come together. We must come together. We must come together, black and white and Latino. We must come together and fight for fairness in the criminal justice system and address the inequalities in the system for black, brown, and poor white people. And we must fight the proliferation of guns in our community. How much more blood needs to be shed before we stand up to the unholy power of the NRA over this country? Yes, we must. And we must fight to protect and expand voting rights and women's rights and LGBTQ rights and labor rights, and we must never give up on the fundamental principle of equal protection under the law. And so as I take my seat, I heard that this was a convention of machinists. And they tell me that when you want to understand a machine, you look at the systems and the subsystems within a machine, rather than just trying to understand the entire machine all at once. You start by understanding the parts, the clutch, the brakes, for instance, of a motor. And then after you learn the parts, you learn how all the systems work together. Is that pretty good? Well, I want to suggest that the same is true with a nation. And the same is true with a movement. We have to learn how to work together. I'm old Southern evangelical, theologically conservative, liberal biblicist. And down in the Southlands, we still remember something called Pentecost. And Pentecost is when all the parts come together. And when all the parts come together, there's power. Power to speak right, power to stand up to domination. When all the parts come together, I want to suggest that we need a political Pentecost in America. And maybe the machinists are the ones that teach us how to do it. Because you understand that if one part is not working, it affects the whole machine. It's time for us to come together, black and white and Latino and Native and old and young and Democrat and Republican and union and civil rights, whoever you are, if you believe in a just society, it's time for us to come together for a moral revolution in America. It's time. It's time. And so I want to preach I want to preach about 3 minutes. I know the power of coming together. I know the power biblically, because when Moses and his people and his rod came together, Pharaoh had to come down and the Red Sea had to open up. When Esther and her uncle Mordecai came together, they were able to stop the plots against the Jewish people. When David and his rock and his slingshot and his faith came together, Goliath fell. And they tell me the next morning in the Jerusalem Tribune that it read, the bigger they come, the harder they fall. When Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, or they call it down in my hood, that bad Negro, came together, way down in the fiery furnace, God cooled the furnace down. And somebody said they saw a fourth person standing with them. I know biblically that when the disciples came together, power came to them to stand up against wrong. But not only do I know it biblically, I know it historically. Truth never loses. It might get beat up. Justice never loses. It might get beat up, but it never loses. During slavery, it looked like justice had lost. But when Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass and Quakers and white abolitionists and Henry Thoreau and William Lloyd Garrison come together, they brought slavery down. When women didn't have the right to vote, Sojourner Truth and Elizabeth Canton Stanton got together and they won the right to vote. Plessy versus Ferguson looked like it had the victory. But when Thurgood Marshall got white lawyers and black lawyers and Jewish lawyers, they went together and an all-white Supreme Court with one member who had been a member of the Ku Klux Klan unanimously voted to tear down separate but equal. It looked like Jim Crow had won. But when A. Philip Randolph and unions got together, and Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King and Bayard Rustin, who was a great unionist, he was gay, but he organized the March on Washington. And when they got together with Viola Davis and James Reed, Jim Crow had to come down. I know the power biblically. I know the power historically. I know the power when we come together. But I also know it personally, because some years ago, they thought I'd never walk again. I'd never be able to come out on a stage like I came out today. They said I might not ever get out of a wheelchair. I was 30 years old. I'd always depended on my legs. But one morning I woke up and I couldn't move. I spent 3 months in the hospital. I could not walk without excruciating pain. I didn't know if I would ever get up again. For 12 years, I was in a wheelchair. For 12 years, I was on a walker. But over those 12 years, the parts came together. Over those 12 years, somehow my doctors and my nurses got together. And then my pharmacists and my therapists got together. And then my swim coach and I got together. And then my family and my church and my prayer warrior got together. Then my faith got together. I can jump now. I can move now. I know what happens when we come together. It's time for us to come together. It's time for us to organize together. It's time for us to vote together. It's time for us to shock the heart of this nation together. It's time for us to say hate will not have the last word, because we're coming together. Meanness will not have the last word. We're coming together. Racism will not have the last word. Xenophobia will not have the last word. We're coming together. And the old hymn says, when they all get together, what a day, what a day, what a day, what a day, what a day of justice it will be. It's time to come together for the heart and the soul of this nation.